Arcane is an extraordinarily well-written interpretation on trauma, psychological violence, and social warfare. I thought this would be a fun thing to do on a part-by-part basis along with the release of the show. With all this in mind, I'll be framing, reviewing, and deconstructing the story in the way that it begins. So let's dive in. The very first scene of this story begins with Jinx singing what seems like a nursery song as she covers her eyes crossing the Enforcer's warpath with Vi. She would only be capable of doing this if she was holding her sister's hand, which she is. If not, she would have to navigate the vestiges of destruction on her own. This establishes several primary themes of the show, but most of all the one that I'm going to be covering first. Transgenerational trauma and innocence. You can only cover your eyes from something for so long. You can censor the world from a child, but eventuality will catch up as hard as it had been blocked out. With Vi and Powder's parents dead, Vander doesn't really seem to care. He's seen punching someone in the background still. It's only when he sees the girls and their reactions that he decides to drop those gauntlets. Throughout the show, we see other characters calling him scared, weak, and other like-minded insults. I think Vander misinterprets these insults and sees them in too literal a sense. He's not scared of the Enforcers, and he's not too weak to stand up against Topside. He's too scared of bearing something called responsibility. He's too weak to challenge a power that can potentially cut Vi and Powder's lives short. Being the spearhead of change is one of the greatest responsibilities one can take. Yes, Vander is responsible for the kids, but in being responsible for the kids, he is responsible for their home. He can censor Topside all he wants, but all it takes is one little misstep and the Enforcers return, which is exactly what happens. The Enforcers probably would have returned even if Vi hadn't led the group into Jace's lab. Much like how their parents could have been murdered, twisted, or imprisoned if they had survived the battle. The harsh reality is that at the rate things were going, any child who grows up in the underground is at best going to turn into one of the adults seen in the last drop. Vander is too traumatized by witnessing the kids mourning their parents' death to realize this. He is bearing the burden of trauma from two separate generations on his back, Silco's and now Vi's. In his limited perspective, these two generations are all he knows. Many expect only what they have been exposed to, and in Vander's case, he has only known that Topside rules, while Undercity stays humble, hungry, and homeless. To him, the lanes is normal life. Vi does not want this for Powder. She carries her generation's trauma, but does not yet carry Vander's. He's done a pretty good job of censoring his own. At least until the eventuality of his traumatized generation comes out in the form of Silco, who, ironically, has similar aspirations as Vi does. Once Vi is exposed to this trauma when Silco comes for Vander, she does a double take on her ideology and decides to leave Powder home. This is something Vander would do, except Powder doesn't carry any trauma at all. She is the one who comforted Vi when their parents died. She may not even fully remember it, being at such a young age. Whatever the case is, Powder's innocence is shown through ignorance, incompetence, and playfulness. She names her toys that are supposed to be explosive weapons things like Whisper and Fluffy. These are her dolls. She's poor. She can't afford toys. She has to get creative. This is how she has fun. It might be a little bit odd to think about, with the show being such an excellent illustration of violence, but Powder has never harmed another human being before. If her bomb had gone off during the little scrap over Jace's materials, she would have killed a boy who had likely been hungry, on drugs, and abused by adults. I mean, even Deckard is being paid by Silco with food. Unfortunately, Powder's bombs do go off just as Vi believes, just during the climax of the show.
Look, I've got these, and you've got those.
They never work.
They will.
Even when the shimmer-infused Deckard is banging down the door securing Vi and company's escape, Powder merely gasps. She sees the monster clearly and seems rather unaffected as opposed to the monster's initial reveal scene.
Wait!
In the initial reveal scene, it's a mere blur across the screen, too fast to see or even hear human characteristics from. And it's never fully shown to indicate how difficult it is to perceive. The other characters react to its introduction with horror and absolute incomprehension, even the mighty Vander. They're all old enough to be considered adults. They've forgotten what it's like to be a child, when everything is stronger and faster than they are. To Jinx, this is her every day. The monster looks and moves no different to her than a normal adult would. A 300-pound adult in most circumstances is going to be stronger than a 150-pound adult. There is a huge weight and strength discrepancy. However, there's a lot that can determine who could win in a fight. Skill, intelligence, mind-muscle connection, flexibility, and 1,000 other things. This changes when you're a child. Not only do you have no experience, but your mind-muscle connection is non-existent. Unless you have a chemical, explosive, or projectile weapon, you are not going to do so well, though I do find it interesting that Powder does attempt to manifest these in her arsenal. Without those, you are probably outclassed in any other area, with the only advantage being that you have less surface area to be struck, have a lower groin region, and can climb into small spaces. Vi is mentioned to be double the person at half of Powder's age. The reason for this is clear. She carries the trauma inflicted on the Undercity during the rebellion. Powder was singing a song. This leads me to the next theme I see in the show. Responsibility avoidance and psychological violence for growth.
You know, but you don't know. When people look up to you, you don't get to be selfish. You say run, they run. You say swim, they dive in. You say light a fire, they show up with oil. But whatever happens, it's on you.
This is a fantastic quote from Vander. It sums up a lot in a little. Not only is Vi a leader, but she's a leader of uneducated kids. Running is simple, but swimming, they could drown. Vander here reinforces that the kids would do what they wouldn't otherwise just because Vi told them to. That's how much they look up to her. They take instructions literally, so Vi needs to have some caution managing them because if she says light a fire without being specific, they're going to find their own way to do it. This establishes a huge conflict and obstacle in Vi's path. She simultaneously wants to protect her sister without exposing her to the dangers of the underground. Milo criticizes Powder's decision to run away during the scrapyard fight. Vi protects her sister and instead blames him. Powder's decision to run away was fatal. She could have stayed close and taken a beating or two like Milo said. It would certainly be better than being knifed or drowned to death. All of them made mistakes, but instead of recognizing this, Vi decides to excuse her sister with powerful responsibility avoidance, stating that she's young. This happens all the time in real life. It's pretty terrifying. Many allow kids to run rampant with mistakes and hand them a ticket that says they don't know any better. Yet this same ticket will incentivize adults to cope with the notion that things are fine as they are and the action does not need intervention. While in actuality, it is the lack of intervention that will cause the abnormal situation where the child is not taught any better. Being young should not excuse you of responsibility. It should only excuse you of evil intent.
I can help them.
Arcane's third episode is named The Base Violence Necessary for Change, and it is also a quote by Silco. This is not only referencing to the nature of class warfare between Topside and the Underground, but also references the nature of the cast's psychological landscapes and how much violence it takes to terraform them. I don't just mean physical violence, by the way. Anything can be violence. Even a thought or feeling can be a form of violence. There are many changes in the psychological landscape of characters found in the show during the third episode. First, we'll go over Vi's.
You did this?
To her, giving Powder responsibility avoidance was a gift. She took the girl under her wing, protected her with it, and allowed her to fly in circumstances she wouldn't be able to run. To her, this gift has backfired, and she reacts in understandable anger. She blames Powder and punches her. Violence is all Vi has had of expressing herself in these sorts of moments. What was once tucked away into the folder of her mind as protect has now been relabeled as trouble. She does what would normally be considered unthinkable to a past version of herself and abandons her sister. Vi is not a perfect person. She realizes this is a mistake and tries to go back, but by the time she manages to do this, it's too late. Silco and company are already there. By this point, she's made a catastrophic blunder, lashing out in a moment where they were both very vulnerable. She should have at least waited to do this. Many adults lash out at children at the wrong time and in the wrong way. It's a communication error and distorts any lesson that might have been learned. Next comes Powder's psychological change. Being excused of responsibility forces Powder into a tantrum where she feels like she's the burden of the group. She wants to be responsible, and she wants to have some sort of control over her future and the future she shares with Vi. She decides to take matters into her own hands and help. She's not used to being alone. Her dependency on Vi has become self-destructive, and when she makes a catastrophic mistake, receives an incomprehensibly traumatic amount of shame, guilt, and blame. Now, she carries a new form of trauma that Vi and Vander did not have, but on top of that, she is aware of the first two traumas that came before her. Psychological growth goes terribly wrong. She becomes Jinx. The third great psychological change is a wacky one: the Enforcers. Witnessing his superior getting killed changed his character in the span of a second, startles him from a mindset of social stability to utter survival. He represents a middle-class citizen not working the best job, cutting himself off from humanity when he clocks in for work. He sees the underground as a place that brews trouble. If it were not for the underground, he might have a better position working in the offices. He's the epitome of class warfare until he sees firsthand the coming eventuality of Underground's innovation. He protects Vi against it, stealing her away from what might have been a battle between her and Silco. In this sense, he's more than just a man, he's a fantastic representation of the spirit of the upper city.
Willing to risk exile for your endeavor. That's quite the conviction.
A counselor! Wait a minute, what a surprise. Bedroom? See you.
And that spirit is obvious enough: the spirit of innovation. The collective psychology of Piltover is yet another change gained through violence. All of Topside revolves around innovation. Jace prioritizing his aspiration for Hextech endangered the lives of both Topside and the Underground. His trauma surviving strictly from intervention of innovation has possessed him on a path he must tread at any cost. In doing this, he neglects standards mandated by the state. This is a violence he commits against himself, his mother, and public safety. Not one, but two members of senior positions help him break the law again, so that he might finish his work. I'm not saying this is wrong or right. I'm just saying this is a form of violence against Heimerdinger's conservative thinking, the city's ruling body, and even the Undercity. Innovation is the very thing that allowed Silco to create the shimmer mixture that he will use against Topside. You could even say all the characters I just referred to are dependent on the innovation to survive psychologically, morally, and emotionally with the conundrums of their respective communities. That being said, every major character in Arcane is dependent on two things: self-destructive dependencies and familial expectations. This stands out as one of Arcane's most powerful themes to me. Vi is dependent on violence, Powder is dependent on her sister, Vander is dependent on pacifism, Silco is dependent on equality, and Topside as a whole is dependent on innovation. But consequently, it is also dependent on its need to have the people feel safe. The keyword here is feel. The society has mistakenly conflated technological innovation for transcendent or social innovation. This puts the dependencies of the two parts of the city into conflict. Dependency in the show is the root for most, if not all, problems produced by the characters. Vi uses her dependency on violence against Powder. Lashing off and storming away is the only reaction she has in situations she feels wrong, just as it is when Topside killed her parents. Powder's dependency on Vi causes the climax of Arcane's first part, and seems to be setting up for part 2 with her dependency on Silco. Vander's long-term dependency on pacifism created the anxiety with Enforcers. Silco's dependency on equality causes him and that bald man to make the steroid mixture. The mixture itself can be considered as the Undercity's dependency on drugs. A Shimmer-infused Deckard managed to kill the Enforcers with ease, and later seemed much more willing to take Shimmer for more power. If there is anything that Topside and the Lanes have in common, it is the willingness to mutilate themselves for more power.
You see, power, real power, doesn't come to those who were born strongest, or fastest, or smartest. No, it comes to those who will do anything to achieve it.
It's not just this mindless lust for power that drives the characters to pursue these great sacrifices either. The power comes with a certain implication, that implication being opportunity. Social opportunity, economic opportunity, even emotional and spiritual opportunity. These things are all mentioned by Silco, and there's a quote he has that sums it up pretty well.
And all the while this question lingers before you. Have you had enough? It's funny. You could pass a lifetime without ever facing a choice like that. But it changes you forever.
The answer that he has to his own question is a big fat no. He hasn't had enough. His quest to have the Undercity rival Topside's power has led him to set aside even considering Vander family. He mentions it himself. He doesn't hate Vander. He even thanked him. During the climax, he stabs Vander and gets grabbed by the neck. There's this incredibly powerful moment where his face just lights up. His expression flashes to Vander's when he drowned him and Vander's now. It's an incredibly important parallel. I felt a lot in that scene and I couldn't explain why. I know I have made that expression before myself. Animation has the potential to capture more emotion than just the physical expression actual live actions might have, and transcend into the audience's interpretations of their own experience. Although it rarely happens, it happens hard when it does. Needless to say, this is one of the many moments of Arcane's that does that. It took me a while to figure out what Silco's expression was. I know I'd made it before myself. Surely there were multiple emotions as he looks startled, though not quite scared. Widened eyes, raised brows, a relatively relaxed lower face, and an open mouth. I realized what I saw. Relief. All this time, Silco is going on and on about how Vander is a monster. He speaks a lot about monsters throughout the series, referring to them as something that lies beneath, mysterious and beautiful. I think he is talking primarily about the monster that is thought. Vander's monster is a mistaken sense of security for people he considers family. He thinks peace is the best option for them since he saw Vi and Powder's parents die. Silco is obviously morally lost for trying to kill children, but he's also trying to show Vander that it's utterly pointless to protect them, since Topside will destroy it all anyway. When Vander grabs Silco's neck, he is proving that his notion of peace is flawed. Pacifism only works on paper. If someone decides to do something bad to you, they can just because. Silco feels that way about Vander since being betrayed, but he also forced Vander to fight him again, just the way he had during the betrayal. This whole time, Vander had been lying to himself. Saying you don't need to fight to protect your family is a ridiculous fallacy. If enforcers didn't kill Vi and Powder, drugs, crime, or poverty would have done it first. Powder had this same mistaken sense of security with her sister Vi, just as Vi felt that Powder's obedience was owed to her. Often, family members feel that other family members have something owed to them, whether it's money, attention, or other. There are a lot of concepts tangled with Powder and Vi involving a sense of back and forth obligation. Powder was never chastised or taught better from that moment she ran away from the fight in the scrapyard. Vi never taught her, she only led. The expectation was built within Powder, even after witnessing the consequences of her actions, that she could be forgiven instantly, an incredibly dangerous and self-destructive expectation. When Vi shattered that expectation, Powder reacts in the worst way possible, defensively and hatefully. It's heavily implied with her stare. She's not just heartbroken, she's wrathful. Every social construct that holds her circumstance has rebounded against her, the social constructions of sisterhood and childhood responsibility avoidance. The word family holds a lot of mixed meanings in America, blind loyalty, familial grudges, and expectations of obligation, just to name a few. You'll notice at the ending, Jinx doesn't get up to chase after Vi. She expects Vi to return. Silco comes back instead. He understands her feelings towards Vi much similarly of his feelings towards Vander. The other characters probably wouldn't understand Jinx as well as Silco does now. Google's meaning of the word arcane is understood by few, mysterious, or secret. In this way, Arcane illuminates not only the mysteries of an undercity pushed below collective public consciousness, but also paints a vivid window into the depths of the psychologically, socially, and emotionally eviscerated human mind.